it's kind of like an intimidating thing or a scary thing if someone says, oh, like my therapist loves me. Oh God, what does that mean? Does that mean there's a sexual, entanglement there? Does that mean that there are porous boundaries? I mean, I think as a species, we're still developing our capacity to love, in terms of like taking care of oneself, having boundaries, taking care of each other, but we're not quite there yet.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience Podcast, an official podcast for the Psychedelic Science Convention 2023, happening in Denver, Colorado, from June 19th through the 23rd. My name is Keith Fiveson. On this podcast, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Adele Lafrance, a clinical psychologist, research scientist, author, and developer of emotion-focused treatment modalities. Adele is active in the research and practice of psychedelic medicine with a focus on ayahuasca, MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. Adele is the strategy lead for the MAPS-sponsored study of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for eating disorders and clinical trainer and supervisor for Imperial College Center for Psychedelic Research. Dr. Lafrance is particularly interested in the mechanisms and healing modalities, including emotion processing, spirituality, love, and family-based psychedelic medicine. I really love this conversation with Adele. We explored her projects, including the Love Project. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Adele Lafrance. Hi. Oh, I am so pleased to have you, Adele, Dr. Adele Lafrance here. It's really a pleasure to have you on the Mindfulness Experience Podcast. As you know, we're an official podcast for the MAPS Psychedelic Science Convention, and you are going to be one of the speakers there as a therapist researcher in the field of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And, it's very exciting. I know you're doing a lot of work, not only one-on-one work, but more group work as well. So can you tell me, what can we expect from the convention and your sessions? You said you have about 3 sessions there, right?
I do. Yes, I do. I'm really excited to be able to share some data for 3 studies that I am a part of. The first study is looking at eating disorder symptoms in a sample of people who participated in MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And so we'll be reporting on some findings that were not specifically related to PTSD symptoms, but actually eating disorder symptoms. And I'm hoping that's going to be some exciting findings for the field of eating disorders, because there's so much overlap in those who struggle with eating disorders, in terms of having trauma history. The other study that I'll be presenting on is related to family matters in psychedelic therapy. So the role of the family, how we can engage family members to optimize outcomes, but also to potentially minimize distress on the system. And so we'll be drawing from a couple of different research studies that I've been a part of over the years, my colleagues and I. And then the last study that I'll be presenting on, and probably the one that I'm the most excited about, is called the Love Project. And yeah, it's fun because, so many people talk about psychedelic experiences anecdotally in terms of like profound experiences of love, of unity. And yet in the research community, we have yet to study this concept of love. And so colleagues and I put together a survey study for individuals who have had profound experiences of love, in the hopes that we can begin the conversation, or at least an attempt to define what that means, and even learn more about how these experiences of love that are engendered in the context of a psychedelic experience can lead to positive outcomes for self, for other as well.
The Love Project. I love
Yeah, me
that. It's
too.
great. It's absolutely wonderful. And the beautiful thing about it, of course, is that just in terms of the other two studies that you're doing, it seems to me that, I mean, it's been used again and again. Love is the answer. Love is everything. It's the ineffable. It's the sense of our interconnection with everyone and everything. It's the expansion, and fear and uncertainty and doubt are the contraction, right? So, when you look at these projects, I mean, we could unpack them. Give me a sense in terms of you're so excited about the Love Project. How does it interconnect with, or does it interconnect with, in your view, with the other projects? Because, whether or not it's an eating disorder of not having enough, not being enough, or, not wanting, or not whether or not it's purging or binging, right? Or whether or not it's family matters. I think of Dick Schwartz, I think of IFS, I think of the parts and the interconnection of the parts, taking the exiled part and bringing it back with love and compassion and care. So give me a sense from your view, how are they connected? And you're involved with all three of them.
Yeah, I feel like as a field, we are not immune to the stigma related to love. Love has historically been seen as unprofessional, as unscientific. If we look back in the history of psychotherapy, Carl Rogers coined the term unconditional positive regard, as a primary tool for transformation in psychotherapy. And at that time, he was, considered a revolutionary and also very controversial because there was a much stronger focus on behavioral interventions or psychoanalytic interventions. And so he comes in and talks about unconditional positive regard. Well, what I think he was actually talking about love, but he just couldn't go that far at that time. It would have been way too risky. Right. And so I feel like now as our culture is maturing, and that we've been so informed by psychedelics, not just at this time, but in the first revolution, I feel like it's time for the psychotherapeutic community, the medical community, to talk about one of the most potent healing forces, and that is love. And we see that because, well, gosh, it's everywhere. But one of the reasons why people suffer, develop, mental health issues relates to their early experiences around love. And one of the ways that they heal is through, current experiences of love. And I think about, Bruce and Marcela, who've done so many of who've been such a huge part of the MDMA study for PTSD. And they really talk about so clearly the role of the love between the therapist and the client as a healing tool, but we haven't yet talked about it explicitly. We're not researching, this topic, and I feel like it's time. So I'm excited to be able to do that with some of my closest friends and colleagues.
Isn't that funny though? Unconditional, positive regard. That we'd have to sanitize it. Like love, like when how would love be a bad word, except it's a little gooey, it's not patriarchal, it's not sanitized, it's not tough and rough and, scientific, right? I mean, so is that why?
Well, that's definitely a part of it. But the other piece though is that, and that's becoming more and more of a part of the conversation today, many people have been hurt under the guise of love, including in healing environments, and so I think that if there is a resistance to the word love, that there are some social, historical, oppressive influences that have shaped that. And also there are ways in which doctors and psychotherapists have abuse their power and hurt people in the name of love, so it's kind of like an intimidating thing or a scary thing if someone says, oh, like my therapist loves me. Oh God, what does that mean? Does that mean there's a sexual entanglement there? Does that mean that there are porous boundaries? I mean, I think as a species we're still developing our capacity to love in terms of like taking care of oneself, having boundaries, taking care of each other. But we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
That is so profound. I think about it and I think of, agape, philia, and eros as the sort of context for love, right? And within as you say, within the community, because psychedelics do break the boundaries for, individuals, and they really just want to love everyone, right? So, within that context, that can be a very slippery slope. So, I do believe that there's a lot of rigor to make sure that those boundaries are in place and that everyone stays in their lane.
That's right. And I'm really excited to see, in the context of this study, how many people felt that the love that they experienced between themselves and the guide, was of critical importance. But we also have a sub-study or a subset of the study questions specifically geared for guides, therapists who've been involved in this kind of work. And we asked them as well, like, how much training they've received in terms of navigating situations that come up in the work that specifically relate to love, incling feelings like of sexual attraction. So I think that we have a long way to go. And that's which is great. We're just getting started in some ways, as this renewal to equip guides, whether they are formal or informal, to be able to create and maintain a container where complications related to love can emerge and get sorted out.
Yeah, and that sort of gets into the discussion in terms of preparation, in terms of therapeutic touch, in terms of presencing, therapeutic presencing, and the whole idea of really having that presence for the individual, which really, shows them that you're there for them, right?
That's right.
It's not just, touch isn't the answer to everything, but it can be a reassuring answer, and it can get very confusing for folks. So,
that's right.
Yeah. So let me ask you, can you share a brief overview of your work overall, and, specifically, how is it being used to treat mental health disorders, and where does it go? I mean, the from the micro to macro view, I think we've talked about individual one-on-ones, but then we also talked about the group settings, and how do they differ from your view?
Well, this research that I've been involved in thus far, I would say primarily centers around developing treatment programs or protocols or ideas for people who have eating disorders. And so eating disorders have the highest mortality rates of all psychiatric conditions. And anorexia nervosa in particular is the disorder where there are the fewest options. And so when I first started off as a psychologist, my first job was in an eating disorder program. And since then, it's been, 15 years, that's always been a part of my work, because there are so few options, and there are so many families who, despite everyone's best efforts, including clinicians, are not able to support the person who's affected by the illness to recover, And so when Tim Brewerton and I and colleagues were looking at the PTSD data, we really wanted to see, what was going on with respect to eating symptoms, in the hopes that MDMA could prove to be a fertile ground for the exploration of treatment options for people with eating disorders. Likewise, the study that I'm affiliated with Imperial is looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for anorexia nervosa, and I think that's going to be a really promising treatment option for some people. And in the past, I've also looked at ketamine, and I've conducted a number of studies looking at the potential for ayahuasca. And I guess generally speaking, I would say that we're so far away from being able to tell like which substance is the best for which eating disorder. I think that I feel like we have a responsibility to explore as many options as possible so that individuals have agency, have choice, and can figure out, like, based on their expression of illness or their inner world, you know, what substance, what medicine might be best for them. But yeah, so that's my goal, is really just to help move that along, so that the next generations of researchers and clinicians can start answering more of the fine-tuned questions. But that before I retire, that there are many, many more options for people struggling with eating disorders and their families as well.
No, I chuckle a little bit when you say before I retire, because you're a young woman and you've been doing this for 15 years.
I mean, I'm 44, so I don't know.
Well, yeah,
middle-aged.
You are a young woman. I have news for you. Being an older man, I consider you to be a young woman. Let me ask you, though, because this is a very serious topic, specifically when we look at anorexia, right? The whole area of looking at it over the last 15 years, and then looking at it also as we start to move more and more into an attention deficit disorder culture that really does a lot of compare despair. I'm wondering, from your view, has it gotten worse? Is it getting better? What are the symptoms around that, and how does that play? Certainly within, one of the beautiful things about research is you get to use substances that aren't quite legal yet, right? And we do know ketamine is legal in many of the states. Certainly psilocybin within Colorado, we just saw the proposition, and in Oregon as well. But I'm just wondering, from your view, has this problem gotten worse, or is it better, or what do you think the causes are as well?
I think when it comes to mental disorders, I think COVID played a significant role in amplifying the need for support across a variety of clinical conditions, but also just garden variety stress and distress. And but with anorexia in particular, I don't even think that we need to consider, is it worse? Is it better? Like, it's been urgent for a long time, and it continues to be urgent, especially now that there are options for people, or for medically assisted dying for mental health related conditions, and people with anorexia nervosa, for example, are opting for that kind of intervention because they've exhausted all legal interventions, and they don't want to live like this. And so there's a lot of conversation in the eating disorder community about, like, is this right? Is it not right? And I see such a huge role for psychedelics to play in that conversation. I mean, and the National Post, I think it was this week or last week, there was an article that came through about a woman who was considering medically assisted dying. And then she tried ketamine, and she no longer is pursuing that option. Yeah. Exactly. And so, I feel like it's going to be imperative for us to offer options to individuals who are really in despair, and in despair in part because they have tried everything that's currently available to them and it's not working. So I really, really want us to push hard to create safe, ethical options, especially for people who are at a later stage of illness expression.
This seems like a problem of abundance in some respect, and not to put my judgment hat on here, but I can't help but wonder if this is more of a Western issue than a problem, that might be experienced, let's say, whether or not it's in China or India or somewhere else in the East. Do you have a sense of that comparatively?
I don't recall the exact data. I do know, though, that eating disorders affect people of different cultures. And I believe that there is a higher representation of eating disorders in North America, for example, but that could be related to a whole host of reasons, including people's interest in tracking this kind of data. But when people develop eating disorders, it's usually a very complex interplay of factors, including genetic factors, including temperament type factors, neurobiology, and then there's what happened to them in their life and how sufficient they feel resourced internally. But one of the biggest aha moments from my research with ayahuasca is that our current conceptualization of the development of eating disorders is extremely limited and really does not paint the whole picture to the point where it can be harmful. Like when I think about when I used to write case summaries after I've done assessments, I was like, okay, well, difficult pregnancy, difficulty with breastfeeding, parent was absent for a period of time, some bullying, and gymnastics coach who said the wrong thing. Okay. So that would be like, okay, so then that's what happened. But when I and my colleagues took the time to interview, many different people who'd had eating disorders and who'd worked with ayahuasca as a healing tool. I mean, people were talking about how they saw in their journeys that the pain that was fueling the eating disorder was 3 generations back, or 2 generations back, or that there were some transpersonal factors that influenced the expression of their stress or distress. And so I felt like going back into my clinical folders and, revise, resubmit every single one of my conceptualizations, because it's like too narrow a focus on the person and their family. When what we're talking about here potentially is it's so much more complex, and there's no one person or system who's like to blame. It's like what World War II did to your family, or it's what the residential schools did to your family. I feel like that's what we need to be looking at, instead of just like, hey, what happened in your life in the last 18 years or 30 years, etc.
I feel like you've just opened up a wormhole here that I want to jump into. From the viewpoint of the transpersonal and a really understanding of the interconnectedness, the spiritual aspects of our own beingness and our ability to nourish, to flourish, to grow, right? And then the epigenetic issues that we've been handed down from generational or intergenerational trauma, perhaps. So when we start to look at the psychedelic journey, whether or not it's the individual journey or the group journey, how does the journey itself help the individual to open up to these issues, these transpersonal issues, these epigenetic issues? And, what do you think that's about? Let's jump down that wormhole, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so many ways that we can describe it, very scientific terms or more like experimental terms. I think about MDMA, for example. It's associated with all kinds of psychopharmacological effects that increase openness, that increase capacity to dig into inner material, to engage with the therapist or the guide in a way that could be, very healing. And then there's the possibility of visionary states, with some of the more classic psychedelics, including ayahuasca, where you have opportunity to learn about what happened the generation before you or 2 generations before, and And that kind of understanding of oneself can make a huge, huge difference. And I'm happy to give a personal example. I struggled with nicotine addiction early in my life. And it's always been
hardest. That's the hardest. Oh my
goodness. It's a really tough one.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's a really, really tough one. And so I have this vulnerability to nicotine addiction. And I've worked on it myself, with my own personal work with an ayahuasca specifically. And in one of my journeys, I got to see the degree to which my grandmother was an oppressed woman. She wasn't allowed to work. She didn't go to school for, she didn't finish elementary school, I don't think. She didn't have a driver's license. She wasn't allowed to have money, so she had lived such a small life. And I remember spending time with her, and she chain smoked, and what I understood from the medicine was that the nicotine saved her from the insanity of such a small life.
Self-soothing.
And so, it was, I would say it was more than self-soothing. It saved her from, maybe even wanting to end her own life. And so what I saw was that nicotine ended up being coded into her DNA as a medicine. That protected her from a far worse outcome. And so by the time I came along, my DNA was telling me nicotine is a medicine. It helps. It really helps. It can save you, And so when people even talk about addiction, I'm thinking, okay, the substance of choice, did it ever play a role in their family's lineage in terms of protecting them from a mind split or, really challenging conditions? And so when I had that renewed conceptualization of my own relationships with addiction or with nicotine rather, it changed so much for me. I had so much more compassion for my grandmother, for my mother, for myself. And then I was able to work towards renegotiating my body's understanding of the role that nicotine could play in my life,
Beautiful, beautiful. It reminds me of, the opportunity that the medicine provides to sort of like go into the library, go into the family library.
Yes.
And, here it is, you've got these books that you've sort of, you've taken out in terms of your own your own efficacy, your own sense of agency, right? Yeah, and yet, when you have the medicine, you get the opportunity to kind of put those books, look at the whole shelf.
Yeah.
And you get an opportunity to put some books back and take some other books out and kind of look at where you're at. And from an epigenetic viewpoint, I mean, it sounded like you did that. That's you kind of like looked at the story and you said, well, wait a second, I don't need to buy into that story. I'm a different person.
Yeah, it's a different time. I have different opportunities. I mean, gosh, the impact of sexism is still real, in particular in the world of research, and not just sexism, but other isms too. And so, but not to the extent that it was, in the 40s and the 50s.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, I was talking with someone yesterday and I was saying, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I really thought that ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, was ratified. So I've been acting out all these years, just, well, of course women are equal. As a matter of fact, I think that they're probably superior, because they give birth. They're the focal point for creation. We were talking about the divine feminine and the reemergence of the divine feminine and the need for the divine feminine right now, certainly in the world. And it sounds like in some respect, you were really looking at that in terms of the Love Project. What is that about? And, maybe we can unpack that a little bit more, huh?
Yeah, of course. I'd be happy to. Yeah. So I am really interested in, I guess, starting a conversation about love. I was talking to Bill Richards about this study before we started the survey construction, and one of the things that he said that really struck me, he said, one of the challenges with something like the study of love is similar to the study of God or spirituality. It's like really hard to define. It's political. There are historical, influences. But if we look at what Bill Richards has done, it's been remarkable. Amazing. And so I was so inspired by him. I'm like, okay, well, if we have to start somewhere, where do we start? And so we started with asking people to describe profound experiences of love under the effect of a psychedelic. What did it involve? Did it involve an experience of self-love, of love towards someone else, of feeling other people's love, including generations past? Did you have an experience of being love, or was it love for the shaman or for the guide? And then we also asked them to describe the experience of love in terms of like how it felt in their body, how it felt with their senses, what psychological characteristics would they attribute to the experience, so that we could begin with defining, what do people consider to be love? And how do they describe it in terms of psychological characteristics, physical characteristics, sensory characteristics? And then we ask questions like, how did those experiences of love change you or change your life, change your relationships? And so then we asked a whole bunch of questions about that. The survey is ongoing, actually. We're gonna keep collecting data. And then finally, we asked about the role of love in the relationships, whether it's in the group setting, where it's a psychedelic experience happening in a group setting, or with a friend or guide, or with a therapist. And then one of the questions that I'm really excited about that I'm going to be presenting, as part of my talk, is what people's thoughts are on the barriers to talking about love as a healing technology. So the goal. Oh, go ahead.
No, go. What I was thinking about the Japanese art of kintsugi.
Kintsugi. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, is that right? And that's really taken all those broken pieces, which might have happened sort of at childbirth or afterwards in some way, because mommy and daddy didn't pick you up as often or reassure you. And then through that process of love, that art is using gold to take those broken pieces to go ahead and bring them back together again. And have you seen the positive results out of that? I think I interjected a little too early. Sorry.
No, that was good. We're just putting the presentation together now. But we're gonna learn a lot from the people who have taken the time to complete the survey. And my hope is that the psychedelic research community is going to be able to offer to the psychotherapy community, to the medical community, pathways for significantly advancing how we provide care in those areas without psychedelics. And so if in the psychedelic research we show, like, listen, love is a big deal. It is worth defining. It is worth understanding the mechanism of change. Then hopefully we can influence the evolution of psychotherapy and healthcare so that love is a much more central theme in care provision.
Now, I know we started out by talking about, the whole idea of psychedelic assisted therapy provider. I mean, I'm coming through the IPI program, the IPI MAPS program, as a psychedelic assisted therapy provider. And it's all one-on-one or two therapists on one, the whole idea of really helping an individual use the medicine for their own journey. But I truly believe that we really heal through community. And I'm wondering if we can maybe unpack that a little bit, to be seen, to be heard, to be recognized, to be affirmed for our brokenness and our story. And maybe perhaps you've got some perceptions or some ideas around that.
Yeah, I think that the medicalized model of therapy provision with psychedelics is going to create some limitations in terms of the extent to which people will heal. And I'll give you another personal example that will illustrate it.
Beautiful.
And I'll talk about community-based models of healing. I was doing some personal work myself, and working with ayahuasca in Peru,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working on internalized patriarchy, internalized sexism,
Mm-hmm.
the way I do it to myself now.
Mm.
And it was so fascinating because the medicine said to me, do you want to fully dismantle these processes of internalized sexism within you? And I said, absolutely, I do. I will do anything. And then I get the message, forgive your mother fully. And that's just the beginning. Forgive all mothers fully, to the point where forgiveness is actually a moot point. And it showed me how life givers have not been given the support that they need and have been, systematically hurt, so that they are not in a position to be able to give their children what they need, want, and deserve. What the child needs, wants, and deserves, but also what the mom needs, wants, and deserves, because that's
it's a deficiency there. How are you supposed to perform if you're hungry? Yeah.
Well, and then what happens is that if you look at the history of psychotherapy, the moms get blamed explicitly or implicitly, and then their kids end up blaming them. And so it's like, it is the biggest tragedy, I think, about the influence of patriarchy, colonialism, is that
the Freudian model. Yeah.
The Freudian model is that, yes, of course, it's really painful when your mom's not there for you. It's the biggest hurt of all. But why is she not there? Because she's shackled by these other systems, by these other forces. And so I feel like we need to blow that up and move outside of that, medical model of psychiatry or psychotherapy that I was trained in, frankly, so that we can really see the big picture. And that requires social change. That requires social activism, so that we can heal from centuries of this kind of problem, at least since our countries have been in existence.
So is that where the womb comes? Is that where the room or the community comes in?
Yes.
Really understanding the container that really holds.
That's right.
The crucible that really holds not only the child, but also holds the community in terms of coming together towards a common purpose. Yeah.
Exactly. Because what would that mom needed? She would have needed community around her to support her kid. And so community is so, so important. That's why I'm so happy that in Colorado, the proposition that passed was not just for clinical use, for people who would feel more comfortable getting service in those types of settings, but also for personal use, because there are so many people, including Indigenous people, people of color, people from the LGBTQ community, who may not feel comfortable going into a clinic, but who would rather be supported by individuals in their own community. And so just last week, I did a workshop for the NOAC Society, where they're doing a series of basically skill building for community members to empower people to be able to help one another in this way. And in fact, there was an article that came through a few months ago about it's called community-based care, and they were talking about how in African countries, and Uganda, for example, 47 psychiatrists serving a country of 48 million, so less than one psychiatrist for every million people. And what the article said was what they've been doing, and I believe that they've been doing this for a much longer time, but that they've been a proving ground for this model called community-based care, where non-specialist providers or lightly trained lay people, so someone like your grandmother, delivers brief mental health interventions in informal settings like homes and parks. And so this kind of care has been widely accepted because it pays attention to cultural context. So these lightly trained lay people, including family members, meet patients or clients or people who are struggling where they are, both literally in terms of physical space, but also conceptually in terms of their beliefs about mental health, because not everyone sees mental health issues as medical brain-based problems. Many people see them as a normal reaction to unreasonable conditions. And so I feel like, yes, it's going to be important for us to look at the regulation of psychedelics, the medicalization of psychedelics, but equally important is is a need to look at community-based models of care so that we can be supported by those who from affinity groups, who are part of affinity groups, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes total sense. And I really do believe that the existential angst that we have is disconnection, right? That's the whole idea of, mental illness, that I'm not connected, that somehow I'm different. And that's really in large part, the thought process around like 12 steps groups work so well in terms of helping individuals with addiction, or looking at whether or not it's an eating addiction or a substance use or a behavioral use issue, is that the real opportunity is connection, to normalize, recognize, to see, to be heard, to be recognized, to have your story heard, and to really be accepted. So I don't think that's new. I think that's old wisdom, indigenous wisdom.
That's right.
Unfortunately, it hasn't been normalized within our culture, certainly in the Western model, where we're taught to be individuated rather than interconnected.
That's right. Yeah, we have a lot to learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters and siblings in our world. And I think that I believe really strongly that, especially with the formalization of psychedelic assisted therapies, if you will, like we really, really need to be consulting people from groups who have been doing this for a long, long time. I think there was this strong movement towards group-based psychedelic therapy, and people, I think that there was maybe some marketing that people were focusing on the elements that you were just talking about, like, it's so important for healing, et cetera, et cetera. But I also remembered hearing people talk about, like, how are we going to scale this up? Let's do it in groups,
How can you make money?
Right. And so I feel like anytime we're thinking about scaling things up, then we're off the mark. Right. And because, like, even with the ketamine, you can get ketamine and like online, and I just feel like the training is not likely to be adequate. That, in order to be able to hold group spaces, you need to know Yalom really, really well. You need to have some really good training in systems theory. You need to understand family processes really, really well. And so I'm hoping that the field is going to act accordingly, in terms of ensuring that the people who are delivering these services have the proper training. Otherwise, doesn't matter if it's in a community, you can just like community healing can increase potential outcomes, it can also increase the potential for harm.
Now we're gonna I can't believe our time is coming close here, and we've just started to unpack that. So you've got these 3 sessions that you're going to be looking at: eating disorder symptoms, family matters, and the love project, right?
That's
okay.
Right.
And when are those sessions going to happen? I know they're, the event or the convention is from the 18th through the 24th. And then we've got workshops and we've got a whole bunch of things happening during the course of that. So do you have your dates for that? When are they?
I sure do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be on the clinical trial stage at 5:15 to talk about eating symptoms in the context of MDMA assisted therapy. About an hour later, 6 o'clock, I'm going to be on a panel specifically looking at eating disorders. The next day on Friday, the 23rd.
The 23rd. So we're on the 22nd.
22nd clinical trial stage, 5:15, and then as the first speaking engagement, and then the next day on the 23rd, Love Project I'm on at 4 p.m. and I'm waiting to hear when the Family Matters talk is going to happen. They're still finalizing the schedule, but I have a feeling it's going to be on the 22nd.
Beautiful. So this is very exciting. Are you excited about this convention? I
am so excited about this convention. I I'm excited about sharing my research, but I'm more excited about being able to see what my colleagues have been up to. I'm going to be participating in one of the pre-conference workshops with Bill Richards, which I'm super excited about.
Great. Yeah.
There's just so much, honestly. And I guess I just wanted to say a little shout out. I'm going to have little poster cards for the Love Study project, the survey study that I talked about, all over the MAPS conference. And so if any of these listeners see one of those posters, to please grab one and consider filling it out if it feels aligned, because we're going to continue to collect data for some time.
Good. Well, I am so inspired, really, by the work that you're doing, especially around the Love Project, the whole idea and the whole opportunity to go ahead and normalize or to integrate the concept of love, which is really, just being present, being able to hear someone, to be able to hear their story and to be able to empathize with them and exchange without, judgment, without, without picking them apart. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could just all accept each other for whatever our backgrounds are? And, we don't have to agree, but we can certainly, fight for the right that person has to tell their story. So, that's so important. So how do people get a hold of you, Adele? And, what are they, if someone wants to reach out to you for one reason or another, is there a website? I know you've got, we touched in with each other through LinkedIn, through the conference, through the convention. But, just if they want to look at your research, they may not be able to go to the convention. How would they find out more?
So I have a website, and it's www.dr and then my name, so dradelelafrance.com. And there they can find information on the studies, including the links to the Love Project. They can look at talks and workshops that I'll be giving. I'm going to be doing a talk or a workshop open to the public on family matters and psychedelic therapy in the fall. And so, that's probably the best entry point into my work for those people who are interested.
Great. So that's dradelelafrance.com. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, beautiful. And of course, I look forward to seeing you at the convention. I think they've got, as I mentioned before, they're expecting 10,000 people. We've already got like 8,000 that have registered.
My gosh.
I mean, it's at the Denver Convention Center, so it's going to be wild. And
Keith, I hope I actually get to run into you.
Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, I'm the guy that'll be walking around with a beard and the bald head. So
I will keep an eye out for you for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to your event, your 3 workshops, and looking forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fiveson.